Chapter 44. After reporting to Shi Yan, Qiu Fu quickly returned to the finance office on the 8th floor. Shuyi was still waiting for him, sitting quietly with a cup of hot coffee. Qiu Fu glanced at her from a distance. In fact, Qiu Fu is a very typical workplace fool. In addition to doing his own job well, he is also very good at following the boss's face. For example, when he sensed that Shi Yan had a personal dislike for Qin Liji, he raised his sword and acted immediately to prevent Qin Liji from appearing again. And today's episode, he can also see that some unpleasant things may have happened between Shi Yan and Shuyi. But he wasn't sure if it was the quarrel between the young couple or what, and after interacting with Shuyi a few times, he himself liked the young girl's work attitude, so he received her politely today. It's just that it was inevitable that he was a little more serious than usual, and he didn't say a single off-topic word in the middle, which caused Shuyi to follow his train of thought closely throughout the whole process, leaving no room for other thoughts. After 2 or 3 hours of interviews, Shuyi seemed to have been wrapped up in this serious atmosphere. So when she left Mingyu Yunchuang, there was no trace of abnormality on her face. Even when she was in the taxi, she didn't take a short break, and immediately put on her earphones to play back Qiu Fu's recording. But Bai Ruishan called it this time. "My sister, are you disconnected from the internet?" Bai Ruishan just got off work, her tone was leisurely, "Or our relationship has broken down, and you haven't replied to the message I sent you the day before yesterday." Huh, Shuyi was stunned for a moment. "Oh, maybe I forgot. Okay, I accept your reason. Then you didn't reply to the news this morning. How do you explain this? I have no place in your heart at all, right?" Shuyi looked out the car window and suddenly fell silent. Although they hadn't met each other, Bai Ruishan was keenly aware of Shuyi's emotional changes, and she immediately put away her sloppy tone and asked, "What's wrong with you? Are you busy recently?" Bai Ruishan took the initiative to open a mouth to confide, but Shuyi's emotions had been suppressed in her heart for several days, and they had settled into sand, and she no longer had the desire to confide like a mountain torrent like what happened just now. Just retelling what happened almost made Shuyi experience the emotions of these days all over again. Especially when talking about what happened a few hours ago, she paused several times, as if she suddenly lost the ability to organize her language, and she didn't know what words to use to describe the turning point of those few minutes. Every time he recalled Shi Yan's blind eyes, Shuyi felt as if his throat was being strangled. After listening to her quietly, Bai Ruishan sighed. "How could this happen? Why didn't you say it earlier? Alas, I don't know what to do. I can't pretend to empathize with you to comfort you. I can only say that things are already like this, alas. Yeah, that's the way it is." Shuyi's voice seemed to be filled with sand, not at all like her usual voice. He is so proud of himself. He was born with a golden key in his mouth. How could he meet someone like me? He must hate me now, he hates me to death. Bai Ruishan really didn't know what to say, so she could only spit out some useless words of comfort. "Maybe things are not as bad as you think. You know, he took away his niece and didn't let her stay with me anymore. He doesn't want to hear anything about me anymore." Bai Ruishan, "Oh, don't be too sad, maybe you can talk a lot more when you meet him." "Where do I have the face to meet him?" Shuyi stared at the car window, fell into a deep depression, and forcibly pulled himself out. "When I think of his eyes as if he can't see me today, I will be fine uncomfortable." This time even Bai Ruishan was silent. After hearing so much from Shuyi, she finally figured it out. Shuyi, just like Shi Yan, likes him very much, that's why he is so sad. But before Shi Yan's decisive attitude, Bai Ruishan couldn't expose this point. Because she knows better, letting Shuyi know that she is hated by the person she likes is pushing her into a deeper quagmire. It doesn't matter. You are just a man. Anyway, you have achieved your goal. Think about Yu Xingzhou and that Qin. They are suffering now. I guess they can't eat or sleep well. Bai Ruishan said, "You go home early and take a shower, order crayfish, watch variety shows, and get some sleep." Shuyi let out a hung up the phone, and the car was almost driving downstairs to the company. There was no way she could go home straight away. She doesn't want to stay alone in a quiet room. The lonely atmosphere will magnify all emotions infinitely. She has experienced this situation many times in the past few days. Although it is a weekend, there are still many people working overtime in the company. Everyone was not surprised to see Shuyi come back. Several girls gathered around to eat desserts. Shuyi calmly shared a portion, then went back to his workstation and turned on the computer. After connecting to the internet, a new email immediately appeared on the desktop. Seeing the sender's message, Shuyi shook his head. This email may be the only good news in recent days. Since last year, Shuyi has been in contact with a financier in the United States. He has 3 world-renowned classics and is highly respected in the industry. He is also a tenured professor of H University. Because of this, his interview invitation is as difficult as skyrocketing. During the past 6 months, Shuyi sent him a total of 17 emails, each time with different content, begging again and again. When the 17th email was sent last month, Shuyi didn't even give up hope. Unexpectedly, when she was about to give up, she finally saw the dawn. Sudden ecstasy swept over. Shuyi was even afraid that he had misread, and silently read the text sent by the other party over and over again. Finally, almost trembling, she replied the email. However, she stared at the computer screen, and after she was overjoyed, her heart felt empty again. Shuyi has always felt that she is a very persevering person. From school, no matter whether it is winter or summer, she insisted on morning reading every day, and when she was working, she relentlessly fought for her own opportunities. Later, when she met Shi Yan, no matter how indifferent his attitude was, she was like an invincible Xiaoqiang who created opportunities again and again. But now, she was oppressed by an inexplicable sense of powerlessness. Maybe it was the look in Shi Yan's eyes, or maybe it was his behavior of blocking WeChat. Shuyi felt that he couldn't do anything right now. Until the turbulent sunset in the sky was engulfed by the night, Shuyi finally moved the mouse and entered Shi Yan's account number in the sender column of the email. She thought about sending text messages, but like WeChat, she should have been blocked. It took Shuyi more than an hour to write an email with dozens of characters. The moment she pressed the send button, she thought, she finally said the apology she owed him. It should be a relief. But for some reason, she felt even more blocked in her heart. She sat down and took a few deep breaths, then stood up holding the cup. Before reaching the tea room, when he turned a corner, he was bumped by Shuyi, who hurried over. Shuyi's feet were unsteady, and he fell towards the table beside him. The corner of the table brushed against the back of her hand and scratched a layer of skin. Shuyi supported the table and stared at the scratch on her hand. Suyilingsu helped her up. Are you okay? As soon as the words fell, Suyuling saw the big teardrops on Shuyi's face suddenly fall down. Hey, no, why are you crying? Suyuling was stunned. Facing the gazes from her colleagues around her, she turned around anxiously. I just accidentally bumped into you, and I didn't mean it. Shuyi raised his hand to wipe his face, but tears fell one after another like broken beads. Shuyi, you. Suyuling didn't know what to say all of a sudden, and was shocked by Shuyi's Oscar-like acting skills. Are you so good? Acting is not how you act. Then he explained to his colleagues, I just touched her lightly. Suyuling's words didn't seem to have any effect. Instead, Shuyi gave up wiping her tears, knelt down, covered her face, and buried her head in her knees. She is timid, she is cowardly, she just wants to protect herself selfishly. She was afraid of the heart-wrenching feeling that Shi Yan's eyes would bring to her. She never wanted to experience it again. At the same time, the annual Financial Charity Night kicked off with warm applause. More than 1,000 industry insiders from all over the world gathered together. The room was brightly lit, and the court was full of fragrant clothes and temples. While pushing glasses and changing glasses, everyone was chatting and laughing happily, but Shi Yan noticed a figure that suddenly flashed in the corner of his eye. He fixed his eyes, and when everyone in front of him focused on him, his eyes followed the back of that slender woman. She was wearing a light blue shirt, a white pencil skirt, long hair hanging down her shoulders, and she was holding a goblet. She walked to the champagne tower and sipped the wine. This subtle movement was noticed by Guanji. He followed Shi Yan's gaze, and after confirming it, he joked, why, interesting. She is Fiona, the traitor of EM. Let me introduce you to each other. No need. Shi Yan slowly looked away, looked at the rest area ahead, and said to Guanji, I'll go find Uncle Guan. When he walked over, he stretched out his hand and pulled his tie, frowning, and quickened his steps, as if he was trying to leave this place. As for Shuyi, when he didn't meet each other a few days ago, he could still maintain his superficial calm and suppress his emotions in his heart. But when she suddenly appeared in front of her eyes today, those undercurrents rolled in, almost drowning her reason. But at this moment, just seeing a woman whose back looked similar to hers, Shi Yan felt restless. Throughout the entire charity night thereafter, Shi Yan felt like a thorn hanging in his heart, and wanted to pull it out, but he couldn't find where to start. In the middle of the night, both Shuyi and Bei. The lights in the night sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows are like beans, embellished into a continuous bead chain along the Jiangqing Bridge. There were a few empty wine bottles in Shi Yan's hand, and there was a strong alcohol smell on his body that could not be blown away by the cold wind, but his face was as calm as ever. The two chandeliers above the head sway gently under the blowing of the wind, and all of them are projected into the wine glasses. If you don't pay attention, it is easy to see a pair of smiling eyes. Perhaps because of the alcohol, the scene in front of Shi Yan's eyes was a bit blurred. He took out his phone and released Shuyi from the blacklist. The original chat history is still there. He scrolled up one by one, not many chat records. He read it for more than an hour. He seemed to be looking for something. After he read all the information in the text message column, he finally had a clear understanding in his alcohol-drenched mind. He was looking for signs of Shuy's sincerity, even if it's just a trace. When he was drunk, he also thought that as long as there were some clues, he could even pretend that he didn't know anything. But the sweet words that filled the screen looked like a joke at the moment. Shi Yan put down the phone, but raised his hand and knocked down the innocent wine bottle on the table. In the life of meticulously taking every step after adulthood, Shi Yan seldom has these small acts of venting. But now, it seems that there is no other solution except to vent emotions for no reason. Glass shards splashed, and the crisp sound echoed in the empty house. Shuyi lay quietly on Shi Yan's blacklist again. When I looked up again, the golden sunrise had already decorated the Jiangqing Bridge with brilliance. There was an important email notification from abroad on the phone. Shi Yan glanced at it, his eyes flickering slightly. In the inbox, there was a letter from Shuyi. There is no basic email etiquette, no title, just a short text. Sorry, I have nothing to excuse, and I dare not ask for your forgiveness. I hope you will never meet someone like me again in your future life. I wish you good health and success. The emotional container that was already calm was smashed by this email. Shi Yan read these few short lines several times, and suddenly laughed at himself. Those so-called cuteness are all her performances to achieve her goal. As a financial reporter, this is her true tone. Sweet talk is a routine, but true love is clumsiness that cannot be concealed. Shi Yan thought, if he had recognized this earlier, he would not have let himself fall to this point. But even so, the picture of her pulling his sleeve and crying pitifully still appeared in Shi Yan's mind. Although reason tells Shi Yan that she cannot shed tears, but alcohol can always play a paralyzing effect here. Shi Yan released Shuyi from the blacklist again, and edited a line. So have you ever been sincere? After staring at Shuyi's profile picture for a long time, Shi Yan sighed and pressed the send button. In the next second, a message pops up on the interface. You are not her friend yet, please send a friend verification request. During Shi Yan's 27 years of life, for the first time when no one was around, he swears. Chapter 45. Deleting Shi Yan's WeChat account was a decision Shuyi made after crying. In this matter, Shi Yan did it neatly, but she was the one who dragged his feet. Anyway, she was hated by Shi Yan, and with his personality, there would definitely be no room for maneuver between them. Keeping in touch with him would not do Shuyi any good except to increase his hopeless expectations. And he won't contact her again, and he doesn't care if he is deleted as a friend. So after Shuyi deleted WeChat, apart from feeling empty in his heart, he felt much more relaxed. In the next few days, she still has a lot of things to do. After devoting herself wholeheartedly, her efficiency has soared, and she has become a workaholic in the eyes of her colleagues in the company. One morning, Kong Nan couldn't sleep because of the noisy upstairs decoration, so he arrived at the company half an hour early, thinking that the leader didn't come anyway, so he just fished for a while. But seeing Shuyi came earlier than her, sitting upright in front of the computer and typing, Kong Nan was inexplicably guilty, and quietly put down the phone. When it was time to go to work, Kong Nan still couldn't hold back, and sat next to Shuyi on a chair. What's the matter with you recently? Are you really in charge of the company? Do you need me to move a bed for you? Shuyi was too busy writing emails to chat with her. I'm busy, I have something to say at noon. What can I do? Kong Nan thought about it and left. The main reason is that you make me very stressed. Right now, Shuyi is preparing the materials for applying for a US visa. Based on her previous experience, it will take a week to do it when she is free. But this time it took her half a day to get it all ready. The day of the visa interview was on Thursday. Although the visa officer had already made an appointment, he still had to work for a long time, so Shuyi took an afternoon off to go to the embassy. When she arrived at the embassy, as she expected, a dense line of people lined up from the hall of the embassy to the alley outside, and it was suffocating just by looking at it. It happened that it was still cold in spring today, and the temperature dropped sharply. Shuyi forgot to wear a scarf when he went out. It was cold in the spring, and the wind in the hallway was no gentler than winter, gushing down his neck with a few strands of drizzle. As if he had no clothes on, Shuyi was so cold that he sneezed several times in a row. Shuyi, attracted by the continuous sneezing in the crowd, Yu finally noticed Shuyi in the dark crowd. He walked through the crowd and walked towards her. "Are you here to apply for a visa too?" While speaking, he handed over a tissue. Shuyi's nose was itchy, so he took the tissue naturally, covered his mouth and sneezed again, before saying, "That's right, I'm going on a business trip to the United States at the beginning of next month." She looked at Yu, remembered the arrangement he had said before, and asked again, "Are you leaving already?" Yu said, "No, I will do a short-term visa." Shuyi wiped his nose, threw a tissue, and asked, "Didn't you say you were going to study in the United States?" "There was this plan before, but the current company has given me some room for choice, so this time I just went to the United States to participate in the previously arranged academic forum." Yu bowed his head, took off his glasses while speaking, and slowly wiped the rain on the lenses with a paper towel. It was only then that Shuyi noticed that he had a pair of beautiful eyes, and the introverted double eyelids did not show the mountains and dews. However, after taking off the lenses, the raised eyetails had a natural and seductive look. But looking into his eyes, the image of Shi Yan appeared in Shuyi's mind. His eyes are deeper, but from the inside out there is an indifference that rejects people thousands of miles away. Another gust of wind blew, and Shuyi felt a chill all over again. "I don't know how I faced such a pair of eyes before and could stick them on them recklessly. Queue for an afternoon and get an interview for 10 minutes. When the two came out of the embassy, it was getting late. I don't know if it was because of tossing for too long, but Shuyi felt his palms were hot, but his whole body was sore and weak. When she walked to the parking lot with Yu, the rain had stopped, but the ground was wet and colder. "Let's have dinner together." When getting into the car, Yu said, "I'll take you home after dinner." Shuyi nodded, "Okay." While driving, Yu answered several work calls in a row, and Shuyi sat silently in the co-pilot watching his mobile phone. The two had little communication, but the atmosphere was very harmonious. While waiting for the traffic light, he leaned his elbow on the car window and looked sideways at Shuyi. "Are you in a bad mood recently?" Shuyi raised his head from the phone and brushed his hair. "It's a bit." In fact, she and Yu had known each other not long ago, but he was a few years older than her, and he always exuded a sense of calmness. More importantly, in this strange city, meeting a fellow countryman is an intimacy that no friend can give. Therefore, facing such an unfamiliar relationship with him, it was easier for Shuyi to express his feelings. Hearing this, Yu didn't ask any more questions. "Then I'll treat you today, so don't rob me, or you may feel even worse." Shuyi was suddenly amused by him, and nodded repeatedly, "Okay." Yu directly chose a restaurant with Qingyan characteristics. When he got out of the car, he received another call, and Shuyi silently followed behind him. The street is opposite the door, the open-air parking lot of Lanson department store. The driver opened the car door. Shuyi came down with her bag in her hand, looked around casually, and saw a familiar figure. She stopped suddenly, craned her neck and squinted her eyes. "It's really Shuyi. What day is it today?" Shuyi glanced at the giant pink balloon tower placed at the entrance of the department store. "Valentine's Day." Shuyi actually had dinner with other men. In the dining room, while handing over the menu, the waiter said, "Today's Valentine's Day, our restaurant offers a couple set meal. You too can check the details on the first page." Yu leaned on the chair, looked down at the menu, and said casually, "Little girl, who told you that we are a couple?" When he spoke, his tone was very soft, with a slight smile on the corner of his mouth, but it brushed his ears like tickling. The waiter lowered his head and whispered, "I'm sorry." You glanced at the menu and handed it to Shuyi. You can take a look again. But when the waiter mentioned Valentine's Day, Shuyi felt another ripple in his heart. My mind wanders frequently while looking at the menu. If Shi Yan didn't come to Qingyan on the 4th day of the Lunar New Year, he should be the one who is eating with her at the moment. Half a minute later, Shuyi sighed and closed the menu. What you ordered is enough. While waiting for the food to be served, Yu took off his glasses and rubbed his eyebrows. Are your parents urging you to go on a blind date recently? No. Shuyi said with a smile, the beginning of the year is quite busy. They don't have that much free time, maybe it will start again after a while. Yu raised his eyebrows, and when he was about to say something, he suddenly saw Shuyi turning his head to look at the entrance. Qin Shuriwe. 1 second, Shuyi hadn't recovered yet, and the next second, Qin Shuriwe had already walked in front of her. Are you coming to eat alone? While speaking, Shuyi subconsciously looked behind her. Nobody else. That's right. Qin Shuriwe lowered his head, his eyes glanced at Yu inadvertently. Are you with your friends? Shuyi nodded. And Qin Shuriwe didn't ask any more questions, but didn't leave either. She stood there and stared at Shuyi. Shuyi didn't understand what she meant, so he blinked. A few seconds later, Yu waved to the waiter, add a pair of bowls and chopsticks. Shuyi also reacted, and immediately said, then let's eat together. Qin Shuriwe pulled up the chair and said, that's so embarrassing. After sitting down, she immediately took out her phone and sent a message to Shi Yan. Qin Shuriwe, Uncle, today is Valentine's Day. Uncle, Qin Shuriwe, all the other men asked Sister Shuyi to dinner. Why didn't you take any action? After posting, Qin Shuriwe raised her head and smiled politely at Yu and sized him up calmly. By the way, he is not as handsome as my uncle, nor does he look as rich as my uncle. No play. Half an hour later, at the dinner table, Qin Shuriwe spoke less and less. When it was time to sample the soup after dinner, Qin Shuriwe lowered his eyes, held the spoon, and absently stirred the soup in the bowl. She retracted her previous conclusion. After half an hour of contact, she felt that her uncle was very dangerous. The thoughts in my head drifted far away, and was suddenly brought back by the vibration of the phone. Uncle, so what? So what? So what? Qin Shuriwe simply hated iron for being weak. She was so angry that she subconsciously aimed at Yu, and it happened that his eyes also passed Qin Shuriwe. Peeking at the cot bag, Qin Shuriwe couldn't help being a little flustered, grabbed the spoon and fed soup into her mouth. Yu, who was talking to Shuyi, suddenly reached out to block Qin Shuriwe's wrist. Wait, Qin Shuriwe raised her head suddenly, but only saw Yu's profile. Only then did he turn his head and glance at Qin Shuriwe. Be careful of burning. In a bowl with a layer of butter floating, underneath is boiling hot chicken soup. There was a sudden sense of tension in my heart. Qin Shuriwe lowered her head, blinked her eyes, and stirred the spoon more absently. She thought, you are finished, little uncle. He is more careful and considerate than you. Also gentler than you. It was less than 8 o'clock when Shuyi returned home. The street lights downstairs have been turned on, and the small vendors have also been dispatched. Although the weather is cold, the bustle is still unabated. But today, for some reason, she felt extremely tired, and she didn't want to do anything. After collecting the clothes on the balcony, she lay down directly on the bed, and fell asleep without even covering her with a quilt. About an hour later, she woke up in a daze, but felt even weaker all over, and felt that she was sweating. When she was struggling to get up, she still felt nauseated, squatting by the trash can and retching a few times, but she didn't spit out anything. After sitting on the ground for a while, Shuyi finally realized that he might be ill. She pulled out the temperature gun and took a test. Sure enough, I had a fever. It began to rain coldly. Shi Yan's car had been parked downstairs for nearly 2 hours. He didn't know why he came here. The moment he saw Qin Shuriwe's news, he was laughed out of anger. Then he put on his coat and walked 80 yards across most of Jiangqing City. But when he actually went downstairs to her house, he calmed down. After the impulse subsided, what was revealed was a deeper depression. Originally, he planned to leave immediately, but Shuyi's figure suddenly appeared on the balcony. Shi Yan's fingers holding the steering wheel tightened suddenly, and he finally didn't step on the accelerator. After more than an hour, the light in that household finally went out. Tonight's one-man show seems to end here. But Shi Yan still didn't leave immediately. He sat in the car for a few more minutes before starting the car. However, as soon as he left the side parking space, he saw Shuyi walking alone with his head bowed under bright or dark lights. "What are you doing out at night again?" Shi Yan clenched the steering wheel and stared at Shuyi. She walked to the side of the road, looked up for a while, and looked at her phone for a while, as if she was waiting for someone. The few minutes of waiting seemed like a torment to Shi Yan. So much so that when he lowered the car window and called out her name, there was a hint of anger in his voice. "Shuyi." The moment he heard his voice, Shuyi thought he was hallucinating. She looked around, there was a lot of traffic, but there was no sign of Shi Yan. Then he patted his head and waited for the car. A few seconds later, Shi Yan's voice sounded again. This time Shuyi heard clearly. "It's Shi Yan, and the source of the sound is from behind." Shuyi turned around mechanically, and under the shade of the tree, he saw Shi Yan's car first. Then, she timidly moved her eyes slowly to confirm the people in the car. "I was afraid that it was really a hallucination, and I was afraid that it was really him." But when Shuyi saw his face, he felt like a dream at that moment. "It's only been a few days, but it seems like it's been years." The eyes of the two collided through the light, and then staggered. Shi Yan tilted his head, said in silence, "Where are you going?" "Hospital." Shuyi finished speaking in a low voice, and added, "I'm sick." It seemed like she was subconsciously acting like a baby, and there was a bit of grievance in her voice that she didn't even realize. Under the night, Shuyi couldn't see Shi Yan's expression clearly, but waited quietly with his head down. After a long time, Shi Yan looked at her deeply. "Get in the car." All the way without words. Shuyi sat peacefully in the co-pilot, not looking at his phone or the banquet. If it was her in the past, she might have asked him directly why he appeared downstairs at her house and whether he wanted to see her. But now, she found that she didn't seem to have the position to ask this sentence. Not with a purpose, can it be a chance encounter? Thinking of this, Shuyi couldn't say a word. The soreness from the tip of his nose penetrated his eyes, and even the tinnitus came up at that moment. No matter how sad, it was she who brought herself to this situation. Shi Yan took her to the nearest second people's hospital nearby. After getting off the car, a gust of cold wind hits my face. Shuyi shuddered from the blow, and became much more awake. She said to Shi Yan in the car, "Thank you, I went first." Shi Yan just looked at her and didn't speak. Shuyi pursed her lips, and after a moment of silence, turned around and walked towards the hospital. Although it was night, there were still people coming and going in the hospital. After a brief consultation, Shuyi took the doctor's order and prepared to go for a routine blood test. As soon as she got out of the door of the diagnosis room, she looked up and saw Shi Yan standing in the corridor by the door leaning against the wall, with her back slightly bowed, her cheeks backlit, and she looked even thinner. She didn't expect that Shi Yan followed her into the hospital. As if sensing it, Shi Yan raised his head and looked at her. "What did the doctor say?" Shuyi fell into the previous emotion again, tightened her fingers on the diagnosis sheet, and said softly, "I have a cold, I'll go for a blood test first." Since it was night, there was only one nurse on duty at the blood draw window. There was a crying little girl in front of Shuyi, and the nurse was making preparations with a blank face. Seeing the gleam in the nurse's eyes as she stared at the needle, and hearing the cry of the child, Shuy's heart tightened. When the needle was about to be given, the middle-aged nurse said, "Don't be afraid, children. Auntie is very gentle and won't hurt you." Shuyi swallowed. "Sister nurse, you'd better do what you say." The needle pierced the little girl's fingertips, and she just whimpered, not crying like Shuyi imagined. But when it was her turn, she looked at the rubber band that the nurse had tied her arm, and clenched her fists tightly, feeling that her muscles were already stiff. Just like crying when she scratched her skin that day, she is really sensitive to pain. Every time she got sick when she was a child, her parents told the doctor not to get an injection, otherwise they would see the scene where two adults couldn't hold down a little girl. Shuyi swallowed. "Nurse sister, can I pierce my fingertips too?" The nurse shook her hand, looked at Shuyi, and said softly, "What do you think?" Shuyi. The nurse applied iodophor with a cotton swab, but couldn't find Shuyi's blood vessel. She kept patting her skin and told her to clench her fist hard. Shuyi clenched his other hand into a fist and put it on the stage. His whole body was tense and his mouth was half opened, nervously looking at the needle in the nurse's hand. When the cold feeling of the needle just touched her skin, her eyes suddenly went dark. A hand went around behind her, covering her eyes. Time seemed to stand still at this moment, and the air stagnated and flowed. A wisp of fresh fragrance belonging to Shi Yan's cuffs instantly swept through Shuyi's brain, and spread all over his body with the temperature of his palm. Like a narcotic, all pain disappears. It only takes a few seconds to draw blood. The moment the nurse pulled out the needle, Shi Yan's palm also pulled away. But his remaining warmth has not disappeared. After a delay of 2 seconds, Shuyi slowly opened his eyes, and took a cotton swab from the nurse's hand to press the needle hole. The moment she got up, the nurse glanced at her. How grown up, you still cry after getting an injection. When Shi Yan heard the words, he suddenly raised his head. Shuyi turned around slowly in front of his eyes, and when he looked up at him, his eyes were really red. Shi Yan's fingers hanging on the edge of his trousers suddenly trembled. He hoped that Shuyi didn't cry because of the needle. But what could it be for? The two walked to the corridor aside to wait for the results of the blood test. In the quiet corridor, even the sound of footsteps is very clear, empty, and cold. Shuyi lowered her head, and during the few minutes of silence, her mood has been up and down several times. Finally, when the radio called Shuyi to pick up the test sheet, Shi Yan finally spoke. What were you crying about? Shuyi. He didn't speak loudly, but every word hit Shuyi's ears clearly. Her throat was blocked, and she couldn't utter a few words for a long time. I didn't cry. Her voice was as thin as a mosquito. She just wanted to think that if nothing happened on the 4th day of junior high school, she should be spending their first Valentine's Day with Shi Yan now. But she didn't seem to have the position to say those words that were ebbing and ebbing in her throat, and she could only say them in another way in the end. I didn't expect that I would be in the hospital at this time today. Yes. Shi Yan raised his eyes and said flatly, otherwise you should be on my bed at this time.
Welcome to Storyverse. If you have any novels you'd like to see or stories you'd like to share, feel free to leave us a comment or send us a private message. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community of avid readers and romance enthusiasts.
Chapter 46. Shi Yan's words directly suppressed the tears in Shuyi's eyes, and turned them into a raging fire, quickly drying up and evaporating in his body. At first she was a little confused, thinking she had heard wrong. But it's that simple. Listen. Wrong. In an instant, all the sadness, all the hidden thoughts were gone, only the buzzing sound in my head. No, why did he suddenly say this at this time? Shuyi couldn't close his mouth, stared blankly at the wall for a while, then turned his head to look at Shi Yan. His expression was light, and he looked at the posters on the wall, calmly. He didn't seem to feel that there was anything wrong with what he said, nor did he feel that it was inappropriate. Shuyi couldn't feel sad anymore. She stared at him blankly for a few seconds before moving her eyes away. The body temperature, which was already running a fever, became even higher, and even the blush on his face became more obvious. You and I. Hearing her hesitating for a long time without being able to utter a word, Shi Yan tilted his head and said calmly, am I not right? Although his words were out of temper for a while, it is not unreasonable to think about it carefully. Otherwise, what should two adult men and women do at this time? Hold hands and watch a movie. According to Shuyi's previous routine, such progress was a bit of a waste of her mobility. Shi Yan looked at Shuyi with some sarcastic eyes. In the state of fever, people's brains can't move very much, but Shuyi was still stunned by him at this time, and felt that his words seemed to make sense, so he nodded dizzily. But so what? All the conditions for the establishment of the assumption have collapsed. Well, you're right. Time banquet. However, as soon as the words fell, the air seemed to vibrate slightly. The two fell into silence again. This short conversation brought out a gap that both sides knew but had been buried all along. Her words clearly meant to admit that it seemed to make the current situation even more embarrassing. That subtle atmosphere blocked Shuyi's throat invisibly, and he couldn't say anything else. The corridor was deep and empty, but the air was heavy. Shuyi lightly leaned against the wall, not knowing what to do with herself. The broadcast repeated the reminder again, and Shuyi came back to his senses, almost trotting all the way to the window. After getting the test sheet, she adjusted her breath towards the window a few times before turning around and walking towards Shi Yan. I got the test sheet, let's find out the meaning. Shi Yan let out a and said nothing, nor did she intend to be with her. Shuyi went to the diagnosis room alone. The doctor glanced at the test sheet, tapped the computer, and said, the white blood cells are high. It should be a bacterial infection, but your condition is not serious now. I will prescribe medicine for you first. If you wake up tomorrow and the fever does not subside, then you may have to come to the hospital. The hospital is hung with water, don't stay up late when you go back, pay attention to rest. Shuyi nodded, okay. When Shuyi came out with the medicine list prescribed by the doctor, seeing the empty corridor, his heart sank suddenly. After walking 2 steps, I saw Shi Yan's back outside the hall door, and her chest was inexplicably full again. After queuing up to get the medicine, Shuyi walked behind Shi Yan with a small bag. She wanted to tug on his sleeve, but she never raised her hand. She stood motionless, not even shaking the shadow on the ground. The sound of her footsteps coming over was so light that it took a few seconds for Shi Yan to feel a person standing behind her. He turned around and looked at Shuyi standing quietly, with his head drooping slightly, his face pale. The slender fingers were holding a plastic bag hanging by their legs, and when they were dazzled by the light, they felt very cold. Inexplicably, Shi Yan wanted to reach out to hold her, but when he raised his eyes and saw her pitiful appearance, Shi Yan's teeth itched instead. Shi Yan, are you dumb? Shuyi looked up, his eyes dim. Huh. What? Shi Yan, let's go. Shuyi lowered his head and responded in a low voice, oh. On the way back, Shi Yan was held in a leisurely manner, and there was nothing to say along the way. Shuyi is very tired and sleepy now. Moreover, she is naturally at odds with things like cars, and when she drives smoothly, she tends to fall asleep easily. However, tonight she didn't feel sleepy at all. She was so awake that she could even hear Shi Yan's breathing clearly. It's just that she didn't know what to say, and the current atmosphere didn't have room for her to express herself, so she quietly leaned against the car window, looking like she was asleep instead. At least, Shi Yan never thought so. From his point of view, Shuyi not only fell asleep, but also slept soundly, without moving a muscle. So when the car drove to the entrance of the community, Shi Yan stepped on the brake lightly, with his hands on the steering wheel, without making a sound, and making no next move. Shuyi didn't know why Shi Yan didn't call her, but she just wanted to pretend to sleep like this. At least I can stay in the space with him for a while, otherwise I don't know when the next meeting will be. The car was so quiet that the only sound was the breathing of the two at different frequencies. The stalls on the side of the road began to close down, and the lights went out one by one. People who worked overtime and returned late dragged their tired feet home, and their figures passed the car window one by one. Shuyi leaned against the car window with her eyes closed, but her senses were unprecedentedly sensitive. Although she couldn't see it, every movement of Shi Yan was in her mind. Sitting in the same car half a meter apart like this, she was already very satisfied. But this silent time also passed quickly. Although 20 minutes had passed, Shuyi felt that it was only a moment. If it wasn't for Shi Yan's cell phone to emit a voice, she might continue to pretend. The voice was sent by Guanji, and at the same time as the banquet was turned on, he unbuttoned his seat belt and loosened his bow tie. Guanji, I want to ask you something, do you have time tomorrow night? Shi Yan typed 2 words, what? A few seconds later, Guanji's voice echoed clearly in the car. It must be a good thing. Do you remember that Fiona from last time? Didn't you take a closer look? It turns out that she seems to be interested in you too. Tonight she has a party on behalf of their company, so she asked me about you by the way. She means that she wants to meet you, and it happens that she is on vacation tomorrow, so I ask if you are free to meet tomorrow. When Shi Yan clicked on the audio, he didn't think too much, and released it directly. However, upon hearing this, he frowned, and subconsciously glanced sideways at Shuyi. She was still sleeping peacefully. Shi Yan still had a sense of irritability in his heart, and he didn't plan to go back to Guanji. Guanji called directly, and before Shi Yan could speak, he began to ramble again. I didn't say that there are really not many talented and beautiful young girls like her who are still single. If it weren't for the fact that I've talked to her friends for a while, I really want to chase her. Shi Yan, are you free? It's not idle, I just drank some wine tonight so I talked. Guanji had indeed drunk a lot, his voice was blurred, and the logic of his speech was inconsistent. I'm not joking with you, you just a word, would you like to come out tomorrow to get to know each other? If not, I will chase after you. Shi Yan turned his neck, switched to his right hand to answer the phone, and said with a bit of sarcasm, didn't you just say that it was your ex-girlfriend's friend? The moral restraint on you has no effect so soon. I thought about it, and I'm not breaking the law. Guanji read out a sentence. Buddha said that love and desire are like running against the wind with a torch, and you must burn your hands. Hearing this, Shi Yan's eyes suddenly froze, and his idle eyes gradually focused on the windshield. Unaware of Shi Yan's silence, Guanji laughed to himself on the other end of the phone. I think I can bear this handburn. He did drink too much tonight and was very relaxed, but he didn't deliberately come to be the matchmaker. How could it be possible for the girl he had a serious crush on to actually give it up to someone else? This call was just to go through a process for Fiona, and at the same time, he was sure that Shi Yan would not be too busy to find time to talk to a girl who only met once. After chatting for a while, Guanji finally hung up the phone. Shi Yan looked down at the phone for a while, and suddenly felt a gaze sticking to him. He turned his head and saw Shuyi staring at him with wide eyes. Woke up. Shuyi nodded. Shi Yan immediately withdrew his gaze, buckled his seat belt, and started the car. The meaning of his action was obvious. How could Shuyi not see it? But she didn't get out of the car, grabbed the seat belt, and asked with some caution, "Are you going tomorrow?" Shi Yan's movement suddenly stopped. He tilted his head halfway, and looked at Shuyi. After a moment, he understood what she meant. "Did you hear that?" Shuyi still nodded. "I heard a little bit." Shi Yan supported the steering wheel with his hands, looked at the street lights ahead, and smiled. "You even take care of this. Fine." Shuyi knew that he was not qualified to ask this now. "I don't mean to care about you, I just ask." After she finished speaking, she quickly unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the car door. When one leg was just stepped down, the wrist was suddenly grabbed by Shi Yan. "Then you want me to go?" Shuyi still kept his back to Shi Yan, even if his hand was held by him. She froze for a few seconds, before turning around slowly. How could she want him to go? When she thought of Shi Yan going on a date with another woman, her fever might not go away. "No." She shook her head. "Of course I don't want you to go." However, Shuyi's answer was within Shi Yan's expectation, and he wasn't too surprised to hear it. It may be that she has said such things too much, but now it sounds a little ironic. Shi Yan didn't let go of her hand, but clenched it even tighter. It's just that when his eyes fell on Shuyi's face, she saw some sarcasm. "Shuyi, in what capacity are you saying this now?" Shuyi self-reflected very consciously. She really has no qualifications and no position to say such things. But when Shi Yan spoke like this, it was too aggressive. "Do you have to be so worried?" Shuyi took a deep breath, pulled out his last strength, and said, "Because the almanac says that it is not suitable to travel tomorrow. Time banquet." "Shuyi, there will be a catastrophe. Time banquet." He twitched the corner of his mouth, let go of Shuyi's hand suddenly, and said coldly, "Go back to sleep." Shuyi took her bag, walked 2 steps, looked back at Shi Yan worriedly, and said loudly, "Really, be careful tomorrow. Time banquet." With one foot on the accelerator, Shi Yan drove the car away without even turning on the turn signal. That night, Shuyi naturally suffered from insomnia. She tossed and turned on the bed until there was a glimmer of light outside the window before she fell asleep. The next morning, she got up late as a matter of course, and felt even more powerless, and her body temperature rose instead of falling. Shuyi sat on the bed for a while, then called the company to ask for a leave of absence, and went to the hospital with yesterday's test report. The doctor last night was also on duty this morning, so it was not surprising to see Shuyi here sickly. Prescribed her medicine, then told her to go to the emergency room and wait for the water to be hung. Shuyi came early, and there were not many people in the emergency room. Everyone is a patient, and there is no energy to speak, so the emergency room is extremely quiet. The gurgling sound of rain outside the window, accompanied by the smell of disinfectant water, made everyone around feel a bit bleak. Especially Shuyi. For a foreigner, working alone, living alone, and coming to the hospital alone when sick, there is nothing more lonely than such an environment. Besides, she had to face her worst fears alone. The number of patients who came to hang water gradually increased, and after a while, the emergency room was full of people. But it magnifies Shuyi's loneliness. She glanced casually and found that she seemed to be the only girl who came alone. It was raining harder and harder. The people who came in behind all had a chill on their bodies. Shuyi looked at the work news one after another on the phone, feeling powerless for the first time. She rubbed her eyes and was about to turn off her phone when Shuriwa suddenly sent a message. Shuriwa, Sister Shuyi, are you busy now? Shuyi, not busy. Shuriwa, then let me ask you something. Shuyi, say it. Shuriwa, that Mr. You yesterday afternoon, the blind date you mentioned earlier, right? Shuyi, yes. She thought for a while, and then added, the family forced me to come here, and the two of us are ordinary friends. Shuriwa, really? You two don't mean that. Qin Shuyi, does he not mean that to you? Shuyi, of course not. Although Shuyi has never chased anyone, he is often chased by men. Based on her experience, when a man like you is interested in a woman, he will take the initiative and will not waste time playing devious games. And when we met for the first time, he said that he is not interested in dating at all now. Shuyi is also convinced of this point. After chatting with him a few times, I can feel that he has too many goals to achieve in his heart, and there is no room for love between men and women. Shuyi, why did you suddenly ask him? Qin Shuyi, nothing to do, just ask. Holding the phone, Shuyi was silent for a moment, then asked with a hint of expectation, did your uncle ask you to ask? Qin Shuyi, it's none of his business, he's not so idle. Shuyi, oh. Qin Shuyi, I am interested in him. Shuyi, Qin Shuyi, are you shocked? Qin Shuyi, sister, don't you smell the single air that I exude all over my body? Shuyi, no, I think he might not be suitable for you. Qin Shuyi, why? Shuyi, he currently has no plans to fall in love. Qin Shuyi, haha, what I, Qin Shuyi, disbelieve the most is men's nonsense. Shuyi, Qin Shuyi, sister, can you help me? Shuyi, how can I help? Qin Shuyi, you help me ask him out, I'll follow you. Shuyi, it's okay, but he is busy, I'm not sure when he will have time. Qin Shuyi, it's okay, I'm not in a hurry. Qin Shuyi, just ask him if he is free tonight. Shuyi, that's really no rush. Shuyi, not today. Qin Shuyi, why? Shuyi, I'm sick. A few seconds later, Qin Shuyi called directly. Are you sick? What's the matter? Is it serious? Shuyi, I'm fine, I just have a little fever. Qin Shuyi, did you see a doctor? Yeah. Shuyi said, I'm hanging water in the hospital. Qin Shuyi, isn't it serious that the water is hanging on? Is there anyone to accompany you? It's okay, little problem. Shuyi looked up and found that his first bag of medicine was almost gone, so he said, I'm going to call the nurse, hang up first. Oh, okay, take care of yourself. Shuyi was already very sleepy when he put on the second bag of water. But she didn't dare to sleep. She was here alone. If she fell asleep, no one would call a nurse for her. After about 10 minutes, she couldn't bear it any longer, and her short-circuited brain finally came up with a solution. She estimated the time when the bag of medicine would be finished, then set an alarm clock, and then leaned back on the chair and closed her eyes in peace. Soon, the surrounding sounds gradually disappeared, she tilted her head, and fell into a deep sleep. When the alarm clock rang, she opened her eyes first, dazed for a while in a daze, and then slowly regained consciousness, remembering what she was doing before going to bed. So her first reaction was to look up to see if the potion was finished. However, the moment she raised her eyes, she found Shi Yan standing beside her. In the overcrowded emergency room, he was wearing a thin white shirt, standing there alone, making it impossible for Shuyi to ignore his existence. But his figure is too real, too concrete. So much so that Shuyi thought that he had read it wrong, or that he was still in a dream and hadn't woken up. She looked at him in a daze, but he was half bent, as if he didn't notice Shuyi's eyes. More like a dream. Shuyi wanted to touch him. As soon as he raised his hand, he was pressed down. Don't move. A female voice sounded. Shuyi looked sideways in search of sound, the medicine bag was already deflated, and the nurse was bending over to remove the needle for her. The moment the foreign body sensation on the back of his hand was lifted, Shuyi realized that he was covered with a suit jacket. Wearing a jacket with the usual fragrance of Shi Yan, Shuyi slowly realized what was happening in front of him, until Shi Yan took the cotton swab from the nurse and pressed Shuyi's arm. He just looked over and said softly, you dare to sleep when you come to the hospital alone for 4 drip, you have a big heart. For no reason, Shuyi's eyes were sore as if they had been smoked by vinegar. She suddenly wanted to cry. After a while, she hoarse her voice and said with a sob, why are you here? After saying this, she was already immersed in her emotions and couldn't extricate herself, almost uncontrollably, with some grievances and complaints. She said again, didn't I tell you not to go out? Shi Yan loosened the cotton swab and saw that the needle was no longer bleeding, so he slowly straightened up and looked down at Shuyi. His tone was heavy and somewhat helpless. Aren't you the catastrophe in my life? Chapter 47. Shuyi is the catastrophe in his life. When Shi Yan stepped into the door of the diagnosis room and saw Shuyi sleeping quietly leaning on a chair, he knew this. He stared at her for a long time without saying a word. It seems that from the very beginning, he has been compromising with Shuyi step by step. By now, he seemed to have receded beyond the line. Thinking about this, Shi Yan was suddenly relieved. Regarding the matter of liking Shuyi, he really has nothing to say, he can only admit it. The emergency room was noisy with people coming and going, leaving water-stained footprints. Shuyi lowered his head and remained silent for a long time. Shi Yan's words put Shuyi into a state of embarrassment again. As if reminding her over and over again of what she had done, and understanding word by word, Shuyi could feel his disappointment and frustration. He was so proud of being alone that he felt like being played by her. When he said the word disaster, he must have felt very uncomfortable. But since he is here, even though he thought she was a disaster in his life, he still came. In Shuyi's heart that belongs to him in the dark secret realm, his appearance is a ray of light. He didn't leave completely and broke their contact, so it was still possible. I don't know if it's because people who are sick are more sentimental. Thinking of this, Shuyi tasted a little sweetness in the boundless sourness, but wanted to cry even more. She raised her hand and rubbed her eyes, her fingertips were already moistened. Just when her tears were about to burst into tears, a girl sitting next to her suddenly said in a strange voice, "Damn, come to the hospital to slaughter dogs, is this a human thing?" The tears were suddenly withdrawn again. Shuyi turned his head slowly and looked at the girl. The girl was wearing a peaked cap, typing quickly, and she was probably complaining on WeChat. Sensing Shuyi's gaze, she paused for a moment, turned her head slowly, and said awkwardly, did I speak too loudly?" Shuyi sniffed. I'm sorry." The girl made a pleased gesture to her, and put on earplugs. "Go ahead, I'm shutting down the mic." Time banquet. He reached out and snapped Shuyi's head back. "Are you going?" "Oh." Shuyi looked down and saw that his coat was still on her, took it off reluctantly, and handed it to him. "Thank you for the coat." She raised her hand, but she was praying in her heart, "Don't pick it up, don't pick it up, let me keep wearing it." Apparently Shi Yan couldn't hear her mental activity, so he grabbed the clothes casually, put them on his arms, and walked towards the emergency room. Shuyi. She took the bag but didn't see her cell phone. I don't know if it slipped and fell while sleeping. Shuyi bent down and searched for a long time before taking out the phone from the crack in the chair. However, just as she was about to stand up, she saw Shi Yan in front of her stopped and looked back at her with some impatience on her face. "Are you going to live here?" Shuyi was still sitting on the chair, looking at Shi Yan pitifully. "I'm top-heavy and can't walk." It's true, she's not acting. The moment she picked up her phone and stood up, she did feel dizzy. Shi Yan seemed to be smiling. Shuyi wasn't sure if he read it wrong. If it's a real laugh, it must be a sarcasm. He put on his coat and walked in front of Shuyi in 2 or 3 steps. "You started again." "Well." Shuyi sighed, grabbed the handrail, and stood up cautiously. But just as she straightened her legs, her feet suddenly left the ground. Shi Yan picked her up and walked towards the diagnosis room without saying a word. From behind, the girl in the peaked cap said, "Provoke." Shuyi froze for a while, then slowly raised his hand, and when he wrapped his arms around his shoulders, he didn't dare to wrap his arms lightly when he saw that he didn't reject him. Sensing her small movements, Shi Yan suddenly said, "Shuyi." There were people coming and going in the corridor outside the diagnostic room. The radio was noisy, but Shi Yan's soft words were exceptionally clear. Shuyi gave a soft Shi Yan sighed heavily, and said softly, "Did you just assume that I'm going to follow you?" Shuyi's heart trembled slightly. The tone of his words was still very heavy, but although it was a question, it sounded clearly like a statement. So he is expressing his compromise in a disguised and helpless way. That's what he does. Shuyi didn't speak, but felt the weak light in his heart seem to rekindle little by little. Now she is sure that people are really sentimental when they are sick. When what he said made her feel sad, she wanted to cry. But now that he had slowly compromised and paved a way for her to go to him again, her nose was still sore. After a while, Shuyi's muffled voice came from Shi Yan's arms. "Don't call me by my first name, it sounds horrible." Shi Yan showed a warm smile, and then said word by word, "Shuyi, don't change the subject." "I didn't think that way, how dare I, I'm just weaker." After Shuyi spoke, her voice became weaker, and she felt that she had no confidence in what she said. In fact, she just thinks that acting like a baby is useful for Shi Yan. This idea has long been engraved in the bone unconsciously. However, Shi Yan obviously did not believe her words. Well, you continue to act. Shuyi, I didn't play. But she thought about it carefully. She had known Shi Yan for a long time. She was indeed acting. Whether it's to create opportunities, to run the train with his mouth full, to show his feminine charm, or to make him feel his love, he smiles brightly when he sees him. But later on, all of this seemed to have become a habit. It seemed that her nature was like this when facing Shi Yan. Even though sweet words that seemed deliberate became natural, Shuyi didn't know when all these changes started, and he didn't know whether those were still acting. She didn't even know when she turned her false feelings into true meaning. I don't know when I fell in love with Shi Yan. So, she slowly buried her head on Shi Yan's chest, and whispered, actually, I'm not lying to you all. Shi Yan was walking towards the outside of the hospital step by step with her in his arms, but when he heard her words, his arms suddenly tightened a little. His face remained calm. Even just a very indifferent, oh, that's it. Oh, what do you mean? Shuyi suddenly raised his head. Shi Yan ignored her and walked faster and faster. Shuyi began to show his teeth and claws. Do you believe it or not? Tell me. Oh, what do you mean? Shi Yan didn't even look at Shuyi. Speak up. Shuyi started to worry, and reached out to hook Shi Yan's neck, trying to attract his attention. What do you mean? Shi Yan stopped suddenly, and the moment he lowered his head, there was only a slight distance between the two faces. His eyes were particularly brightly reflected by the lights in the corridor, and Shuyi's shadow was in his dark pupils. Shuyi suddenly held his breath. On the tip of the nose, only the breath of Shi Yan blows slowly. When she saw Shi Yan, she smiled slightly. It depends on what you mean. Shi Yan's words made Shuyi a little dizzy. It is different from the dizziness in the disease. It was as if she had been drowning for a long time, and after being picked up by someone, she inhaled too much oxygen in one gulp, and now she felt a little floating. Along the way, she was full of thoughts about how to perform, without saying a word. She could no longer ignore Shi Yan like she used to. At that time, she was only thinking about getting revenge on Yu Xingzhou and Qin Leji, and she didn't care what Shi Yan thought of her, or how she responded to her. But now she cares. Shuyi was so absorbed in thinking over and over again that Shi Yan glanced at her several times, but she didn't notice. It wasn't until the car arrived downstairs at her house that she couldn't help but said, I don't know how to behave, why don't you give me some highlights? Shi Yan pursed her thin lips into a straight line, not wanting to answer her question. Shuyi moved closer and tugged on his sleeve, or you let me take the test naked. Naked test. Shi Yan curled his index finger and pressed it against his lower lip, but his eyes looked at Shuyi from top to bottom. How do you want to take the test naked? Shuyi. Why is this person full of yellow trash lately? Forget it. She hurriedly opened the car door with her bag in her hand. I don't mean that with a yellow accent. When getting off the car, Shi Yan heard her muttering it's really obscene in a low voice. Shi Yan felt that he might be a bit masochistic. Hearing her scolding, he actually felt like laughing a little. Shuyi walked a few steps, and suddenly heard Shi Yan calling her. Bookish. She froze. It's Bookie, that's right, not Shuyi. What's wrong? Shuyi's mouth curled into an uncontrollable arc, and he turned to look at him. Shi Yan picked up her mobile phone from the passenger seat. Oh, I forgot my phone. Shuyi trotted over, stretched out his hand into the car window, just touched the phone, but Shi Yan put it back. Shuyi was confused. What's wrong? Shi Yan propped up the car seat with his arms, pinched her mobile phone, and shook it carelessly twice. Did you forget something? Shuyi was even more confused. What did I forget? Shi Yan, think about it. Shuyi thought about it seriously, then poked half of his head into the car window. Forgot to tell you, thank you for taking me home. Shi Yan narrowed his eyes, looked away, and returned the phone to her. Shuyi took the phone and held it in her hand. A distant picture suddenly flashed into her mind without warning. It seemed like a long, long time ago, and it was such an extremely cold day. The downpour seemed to be peaking the city, and she stood at the gate of Warner Manor with her mobile phone in her hand, and she had the backbone to refuse the banquet that was going to take her home. At that time, he also looked like this, staring at her with cold eyes. However, on that day, winter was approaching, and there was a biting chill in the wind. Today, although the wind is still piercing, spring will return to the earth and everything will recover. What are you in a daze for? Seeing that she didn't move, Shi Yan asked. Shuyi became emotional again. It was rare to show a calm look in front of him, lowered his eyes, and said softly, it's nothing, I just remembered the first time we met, I refused you to send me home. I feel like I missed 100 million. Shi Yan looked at her deeply. After a while, Shuyi thought that he was about to turn on the mocking mode again, but he heard him say, "Who told you that was the first time we met?"
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to our channel for more captivating illustrated romance audiobooks. Don't miss out on our latest releases and be part of our growing community. Hit that subscribe button and embark on an enchanting journey with us.